Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron, and I run a ministry called Capturing Christianity. It's aimed at exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief. I'm actually a photographer, if you didn't know that. That is my profession, and so I sort of do apologetics on the side. It's something that I really think about and like a lot. It's a big interest of mine. Well, anyways, if this is your first time here on the show, watching, I host discussions every now and then between Christians and non-Christians, and it's a fairly regular basis. We actually had one just a few days ago, but I try to schedule them about once a month. And today we have a sort of clash of the YouTubers. We're discussing the moral argument with Cosmic Skeptic and Inspiring Philosophy, and both of these guys run very successful, very successful YouTube channels. Alex O'Connor is the creator of Cosmic Skeptic. He's the guy there with the green background. And he's been doing it for about 2 years, and he has nearly 200,000 subscribers, which is insane. And he recently posted some videos that concern the moral argument, and so I figured it was a good idea to invite him on to have a discussion. And these are very informal discussions. They're structured in some sense, but I invited him on to discuss with a seasoned apologist, so we could have a little back and forth about the moral argument, some of the ideas that were presented in his video there. And so, on the other hand, Michael is the mastermind behind Inspiring Philosophy, and his channel boasts some 60,000 subscribers. I think you guys just surpassed that fairly recently, so that's pretty cool. And so Michael has his own set of videos on the moral argument. If you want to go check those out, just go to his channel and search. There's all his videos on morality and ethics and God and all that stuff, so go check those out after the show. And if you want to learn more about my guest, head over to the website, capturingchristianity.com. That's also where you can go to find all of our social media links, Facebook, Twitter. Facebook is actually where we do most of our stuff. Twitter, I'm on there every now and then. And we also have a podcast. So if you want to search for that on iTunes, SoundCloud is also where it's hosted. And if you've been enjoying the content that we've been producing, do two things. First, hit the subscribe button. That's really easy. It's also free. Secondly, head over to patreon.com/capturingchristianity. We've recently introduced a early access model on Patreon. So people that donate, I think it's $5 a month, get early access to articles and podcast episodes. We recently just released a podcast episode on Friday that was really interesting. It's got a ton of hits, actually. Well, anyways, let's that out of the way. It's only been a couple minutes. It's a pretty good intro. Let's jump right into the show. So today, like I said, we're discussing the moral argument. So welcome to the show, guys, Alex and Michael. Michael, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you. Yeah, thanks for having me back.
And so, Alex, tell me a little about the what sort of sparked the video that you posted recently. I mean, it wasn't that long ago, right? It was like 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, so it really wasn't long ago. Basically, as people who follow my channel will know, for the past few months or so, I've been a bit out of action due to exams, so I haven't been uploading or anything. But over that time, it's not like I wasn't thinking about philosophy, because it's what I do. It's my favorite thing to do. So although I couldn't upload, I was doing a lot of thinking, and the main thing on my mind was moral philosophy. And so because I had this big gap, I had this incredible breadth of time that I don't usually get to think about this one topic that was on my mind before kind of dealing with it and moving on. So I was thinking about it for a very long time and thinking about it from an atheistic perspective. And it only fairly recently struck me that it's not necessarily a given that if God exists, morality has to be objective, which I think many people do treat that as a given. And so when that thought struck me, I realized just how many avenues there are to talk about moral philosophy from, and I realized that I was inevitably going to be talking about all sorts of problems that stem from morality, things like nihilism, things like religious morality and atheistic morality, and Sam Harris's morality. And I realized that the thing that I'll need to do first is make a clear case for my moral philosophy, what I mean by certain terms, what I think about certain moral ideas. And so I thought that I'd do a short series basically covering all grounds, and the best place to start, I thought, was with religious morality, followed by one covering atheistic morality, and then it's kind of all bases covered. So even if I'm talking in the context of a God existing, I can still make my case and still refer to a video. So it was mainly just to get my philosophy out there in a coherent form, you know.
Well, I think it's safe to say that the moral argument is something that a lot of people find fascinating, at least, you know, if anything, to think about, because morality is so it hits us on sort of an existential level. And so it's fun to think about. And you don't really have to be a super intelligent philosopher to really think about these issues and to be moved by them. So I think it's really cool that we've got you here, that you've been thinking about it. And then also, on the other hand, Michael has produced a series of videos on the moral argument. Why don't we talk about those a little bit, and then we'll jump into the discussion. So so what have your what's sort of the rundown of your videos and the types of videos that you produced on the moral argument?
Well, I did a series on meta-ethics about a year ago. I basically started and I finished it up in about February. In conjunction with that, I did 2 videos on the moral argument, which are not really part of meta-ethics. They're more of like looking at moral realism within meta-ethics and making a metaphysical argument from there. So I basically just wanted to make an argument about the overview of the most used views in meta-ethics. I left a lot out, to be fair. And then I wanted to argue for moral realism, specifically non-natural moral realism, and then offer some critiques, some of the major views, like the views in non-cognitivism, different forms of relativism, J.L. Mackey's error theory, etc. So that was just the basis of it. And then on top of that, I built 2 arguments for the moral argument on top of that. I didn't use Craig's moral argument. I'm not a big fan of that because I don't think it says enough. So I presented my own moral argument in that, and I just defended it over 2 basic videos.
Yeah, so in my study of the moral argument, I've noticed basically 2 big parts of it. And the first part is sort of establishing that moral realism is true. And in Craig's version of the argument, that's premise 2. And then the second part of the argument is establishing that God is in some way necessary for morality. And that's his premise 1 of the argument. But before we do that, and we're not getting into Craig's argument, like I said, or like you just said. So why don't we let's get a rundown of like the list of premises in your argument, and then we can sort of address each one by one.
Okay, so the basic argument I put forward, I based it on Linda Zebzip, I never can pronounce this right, Linda Zebsky's moral argument. So my basic goes premise 1, morality is a rational enterprise. Premise 2, if moral realism is true, meaning moral values and duties exist. Premise 3, the moral problems and disagreements among humans are too much for us to assume moral values and duties are grounded in a human source of rationality. Premise 4, moral facts and duties are grounded in a necessary rational source. Premise 5, this source is what we call God. So I'm basically arguing, I defend them a little bit more in detail in the videos, but the basic argument is if morality is subjective, if it is irrational, as it's not a natural enterprise, it's a rational enterprise. If that's the case, it has to be grounded in a necessary rational source, and then we just call this source God. So that's basically the form of the argument. And so I understand the most controversial premise would be premise 2, moral realism is true. And so I've done a couple of videos defending that as well.
Yeah, so let's just go ahead and jump into that, into the discussion about moral realism. And I know that before we came on, you had a couple books that were right next to you where a couple atheists are basically defending moral realism. So why don't we into the you can show them if you want, but
well, if you want to know some books on a lot of this stuff, I highly recommend this book here, Meta Ethics by Andrew Fisher. He's not arguing for a particular view, but he does a really good job presenting a lot of the arguments. Another great book defending moral realism would be Ruth Schaefer Landau's book, Moral Realism, a Defense. Thomas Nagel has got some great papers. This is another good book called Mind and Cosmos. He goes into some other topics as well, other than just ethics. For natural moral realists, everyone talks about Sam Harris's ethical naturalism. I think a better book would be Moral Realism by Kevin DeLapp. He's an ethical naturalist, and I think he's more honest. I think he's more open. He addresses a lot more objections that are present in philosophy. So if you want any good books on it, I highly recommend those books and whatnot. And I'll be referring to them probably more than likely throughout the discussion.
All right, so let's jump into your argument for moral realism. Like, what's yeah, let's just jump into it.
But first, I wanted to ask Alex a question if he's okay with that.
Of course.
Yeah. What is your specific meta-ethical view? Because when I watched your videos, I wasn't really sure where you were coming from. Sometimes I thought you were kind of arguing for a position of relativism. Sometimes I thought maybe it was non-cognitive. I couldn't really nail down exactly where you were arguing from.
Sure. I think I would probably be best described as a non-cognitivist. I wouldn't call myself a relativist for the fact that, in effect, I suppose it could be summed up as the view that moral propositions hold no truth value. So I wouldn't say I'm a relativist because I wouldn't say that people can be true dependent on their culture or their opinion, let's say. I would argue that they can't be true, but they also can't be false. I think it's probably quite close to emotivism. However, I don't think the reason that I wouldn't call myself an emotivist is because I don't think that when someone says this is good, that what they mean is that, well, you know, the boo hurrah theory, the idea that they just disapprove of it. I think that they do mean something more than that. I just think that what they mean can't be justified in objective terms. It can't be shown to be true or false in an objective sense. This is another problem I have. Sometimes when I say this, you know, like when I say moral propositions have no truth, I think it needs to be understood that when I talk in those terms, what I mean to say is that it has no objective truth. It seems an odd thing to say that there can be such thing as subjective truth, but for instance, I'm not denying that people subjectively feel something is true, if you know what I mean. It's an objective fact that people subjectively experience something as though it were true. I just don't think that moral statements, no matter what they are, can be objectively either demonstrated, but even if they couldn't be demonstrated, I don't think that they could be objectively true or false. I don't know what you'd call that. Perhaps non-cognitivism is a fair label.
I mean, we can just go with general non-cognitive for now, maybe not pick the specific view in there, because there's a lot of different non-cognitive issues. So what do you mean?
You said that really fast. And let's try to get some of the definitions of these terms really quickly for those that might not be familiar with the meta ethics. So yeah, let's talk about cognitivism versus non-cognitivism.
Well, most views can be summed up in either one of those two. Cognitivists would say that moral statements have like a truth atmos status. So when I say murder is wrong or rape is wrong, that can either be true or false. A non-cognitivist says that they can't be true or false, that it's just something we feel. And so like if I desire something, well, desires can't be true or false. Or if I have a feeling or an emotion, that can't be true or false. And that's kind of what a non-cognitivist does. And there's various forms: prescriptivism, emotivism, expressivism, quasi-realism, etc. So that's sort of the difference between cognitive and non-cognitivists. Moral realists or cognitivists, as well as relativists are, and error theorists, we would say that when someone makes a moral claim, they are expressing something true or false. Non-cognitivists say they're not, essentially. So Alex, you said that moral statements or moral facts, I guess, can't be demonstrated. So can you explain to me what you mean by that? They can't be demonstrated.
Well, that's actually, I sort of mentioned that in passing. I almost regret having phrased it that way because I don't think that necessarily has any relevance, in the sense that there are certain moral propositions that even if you accepted an objective, even atheistic case, there are certain propositions that can't be demonstrated, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it follows on that they're not objective. So this is a confusion that actually cropped up when I made my video. People seem to think that what I meant by objective was the ability to demonstrate something is true. That's not what I mean at all. Sam Harris gives a good example in The Moral Landscape, a book otherwise that I have too many problems to name with, but he gives the example of, if I were to ask you how many people were bitten by mosquitoes in the past hour worldwide, there is an answer to that, and that answer is an objective truth. Now, we couldn't possibly demonstrate that objective truth. We don't have the means, but that's not to say that it's not objective. So we can say, for instance, if I said that there were an even number of people who'd been bitten by mosquitoes in the past hour, I know that that is either objectively true or false. So I know that it's, let's say, in the realm of objectivity without even being able to demonstrate either way. So with a moral proposition, if you say that murder is wrong, it's not the fact that you can't demonstrate that makes it not objective. That's just kind of a side part. The reason that it's not objective is not because you can't demonstrate it. So although I think that there are moral statements that you couldn't demonstrate, I don't think that's why they're not objective.
Okay, so then why would they not be objective? In your train of thought, why would you say they're not objective? What would be your reasons? Just general overview. You don't have to go too much into detail.
Sure thing. Well, I think it's important to define what we mean by objective, because this is where a lot of the confusion lies. And as far as I'm concerned, for something to be objectively true, it must be true, or something to be objectively true or false, it must be true or false regardless of, let's say, human conviction. It must be true or false regardless of whether or not people want it to be true or think that it's true. So for me, morality is a kind of it's a thought, it's an expression, it's something that can't be said to be true without humans thinking that it's true, because all morality is humans thinking something is true. It's difficult to put into words. It kind of like my metaethical view tends to kind of emerge from discussions when you start putting the pieces together. But as far as I'm concerned, in order to say that morality is objective, you would need to ground your morality in something that is not human opinion. You need to ground it in something either naturalistic, that is to say the kind of thing that Sam Harris tries to do, or you'd need to ground it in supernaturalism, which I think is unjustified. And even if you ground it in supernaturalism, this is what my first video tried to demonstrate, I don't think even then you could say that morality is objective. So the only way that I think you could truly show morality to be objective is to come up with some naturalistic synonym for words like good or bad or ought or ought not. And I think, as I think you probably think, I don't think you can do that. I don't think that naturalism is a valid metaethical view.
Now, I want to go back to one thing you said, because I thought you might just be begging the question against a moral realist. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but you said all morality is thinking it's true. Is that correct?
Well, I suppose I would say that when you make a moral statement, the person, what I meant by that was that when you make a moral statement, most people intuitively think that, so like you say, when someone says that murder is wrong or the Holocaust was wrong, that's a classic. They have no doubt in their mind that that is true. What I'm trying to say with that is basically making the case that even though they think it's true, that's all it is. They think it's true, but it's not actually objectively true.
So then let me ask you this. I mean, one of the reasons most philosophers are more realistic, I think their last poll was like 56% are, is because it's just so dang intuitive. So when you say all that it's, all that it is that it's thinking of it. My issue with that is like, well, I mean, everything we think is technically subjective. I mean, everything about science we think is subjectively processed in the mind. Everything about mathematics or logic is. That doesn't mean those are subjective. I mean, that just means that's how we experience them. It's a kind of confusing epistemology with ontology. Just because we may experience morality subjectively, that does not necessarily mean there aren't objective moral facts out there. Just like we experience, science, we actually have to experience it subjectively through our own cognitive senses and whatnot. So why would it follow that just because that's how we experience it, that it necessarily is subjective?
Well, I think that if you are going to be technical about it, then you have to accept that things like science or the scientific method ultimately do rely on our subjective experience of existence. But the way that I would get around that is as follows. I would subscribe. So I subscribe to that notion that we have to kind of begrudgingly accept the fact that I can never really know whether or not I'm really having this conversation, whether or not you two are really speaking to me, or whether I'm just a brain being stimulated in a lab. So that's a problem, but I don't think that necessarily closes down the debate, because I can say things, for instance, I subscribe to Descartes' notion, I think therefore I am. I think it's fair to say that in order to even be under the illusion that I'm here having this conversation, I need to exist in some form. So to me, that says that existence is a thing. Existence exists, if you know what I mean. So yeah, there is such thing as existence. Now, if I say that there is a cup sat in front of me, which I think I have here, as a scientific worldview, like you say, because I have to interpret that through my senses, which I don't know if I can trust, I don't know whether or not this glass objectively exists. However, I do know that it either objectively exists or objectively doesn't. The statement, this cup exists, is either objectively true or it is objectively false. So yes, I do have to interpret that through my subjective senses, but I can still know that that's either objectively true or false. Whereas with morality, I'd go further than that and say that it can't be in principle objectively true or false. So it doesn't matter to me necessarily the process by which we're coming to the conclusion. Rather, I'm just saying that the conclusion has to be either that the cup does exist or doesn't exist, and we may never be able to know that, but we know that it still lies within the realm of objectivity. That statement, the cup exists, lies within the realm of objectivity because it either objectively exists or doesn't, whereas morality doesn't do that. So yes, we have to interpret both, because, well, I suppose I'd have to ask your case. I'd have to say, let's put it this way. As of yet, I'm unconvinced that it does. So I'd like to know, let's say, why you think that it could reside in the realm of objectivity, and then I could tell you why I find that unconvincing. That's about as far as I could go.
Okay, yeah, you've talking. I've been asking you questions for a while. I can kind of present my case here. So, basically, the main reason that someone like Thomas Nagel or Kai Nelson would say that moral realism is most likely true is how the moral duties and values would manifest in moral actions or in reality itself. So, like, take for example another normative ought. Like, we ought to be intelligent. Now, if we met someone who just watched Jersey Shore all day, or Georgie Shore, because I know you're in Britain, they said they aren't really interested in learning philosophy, they don't want to be intelligent, we would be like, okay, well, that's not a pragmatic solution. That's not a very, we don't really necessarily agree with that, but we wouldn't say that they did anything wrong. We wouldn't say that they're doing something objectively wrong. We just say they're not being a very pragmatic individual. When we study moral facts, specifically duties and values, they tend to manifest in a way in reality within our actions that tend to be objective. So although we may disagree on the correct normative status, you know, virtue ethics versus deontology versus type of utilitarianism, everyone does agree that the way they manifest appears to be pretty objective. It's really hard to act out or even to disagree with someone that says that female mutilation is a good thing. If someone says that, we would be like, oh, no, it isn't. I mean, that's clearly something we would want to debate. So moral facts tend to manifest in reality the same way logical facts tend to manifest. They're objective, independent, even if we may not agree, if someone may disagree or may think something else. So the basic argument, and I can give you a quick quote here from Kai Nelson, for example. Kai Nelson says, "It is more reasonable to believe such elements, things like wife beating and child abuse, are evil than to believe any skeptical theory that tells us we cannot know or reasonably believe any of these things to be evil. I firmly believe that this is bedrock and right, and that anyone who does not believe it cannot have probed deeply enough into the grounds of his own moral beliefs." So Kai Nelson, David Brink, Richard Boyd all argue, from a basic intuitive standpoint, moral realism is pretty intuitive. If we're going to apply the principle of credulity, we have to accept that it is at least our intuitive starting point. This seems to be the case as we act in reality, as things manifest in moral experience or through things like moral progress. So if that's the case, the skeptic has to mount an argument against how they I don't want to use the word naturally, how they basically just simply appear within reality, how they tend to manifest between moral agents. So what would be a good skeptical argument for doubting our basic intuitive starting point?
Well, I'd say because that's effectively the basic premise of skepticism. The whole point of skepticism is that you take nothing for granted. So something like the, let's say the principle of credulity, as long as I understand the same thing as you do by that, I take to be a horrible idea. It's true that we intuitively feel that morality is the case, but that in no way to me, I don't see how you could say that because we feel something more strongly, we have more reason to believe that it's the case.
Well, it's not so much a feel. I mean, Rouchet-Ferlandot defines intuitions as conscious experiential states. One of the things he says is like, let me ask you this right now. He uses a pretty good example. Are there people in Montreal right now? Now, without looking it up, without actually going to Montreal, it tends to be a pretty reasonable argument. That's a good starting point to assume. We don't assume any alien abductions have happened within the past 5 minutes. We tend to just start with an intuitive, reasonable point right there. And so the principle of credulity doesn't say we just believe what we feel. It says we take what seems to be so as indeed unless someone has positive reasons to doubt. Take A theory of time. I don't think A theory of time is true, but it seems pretty intuitive. We have pretty good scientific evidence that B theory of time is most likely true. So we have good reason to doubt our intuition there. So my basic point would be, as most moral philosophers that are more realists argue, is like, why should we doubt this if it seems so intuitively obvious? If moral facts manifest in a way that are objective, why would we doubt that they're not objective like the laws of logic are?
because historically the things that have been most important to discuss philosophically are things that we used to take for granted. It's like, yes, it's true that we have very, very strong intuition of moral duty, but in the same way, I have an incredibly strong intuition that I have free will. And previously, either speaking previously in terms of the species or previously in terms of my own personal experience, I had very strong intuitions that God existed. These are now things that I'm convinced, either in the case of free will, I'm convinced of the exact opposite. And in the
Why?
case,
Why are you convinced that there's no free will?
Because of, well, the reason that I was even able to have that discussion was because I didn't trust that intuition, or the moment that I questioned that intuition was the moment that I could delve into it. Now, let's say that I have a very strong intuition that God exists, as I think most people do, especially at a young age. I'm sure that you two did too. I don't know your history in Christianity. I don't know if you've always been Christians, but let's take someone who has. He and I would have started in the same position. We both had a fairly strong intuition that God existed. Now, you can become aware of that intuition and become aware that you should probably break that down and not just trust the intuition for intuition's sake, and that you should question it and see if you can justify it. And once you've done that, you may find that you very well were justified in your intuition. So I had an intuition that God existed, and I didn't even think about questioning it. But the moment that I realized, well, hold on, I can't just take something for granted because it's intuitively strong. I questioned it, and now my entire philosophy has shifted. But there are people who've done the same as me, who had that intuition and decided to challenge it and ended up thinking that their original intuition was right. That's fine. But the reason that you doubt intuition is the reason you doubt anything. It's because that is the basic premise of skepticism. You take nothing for granted and you question everything that you think to question.
Okay, well, I agree with what you said. We should challenge our intuitions. I'm not saying that, but you basically just kind of made the point I was trying to make, that we have these intuitive starting points. We should go out and challenge them and whatnot. But if we don't have good reason to doubt them, we're not going to doubt them. I mean, I agree with you on skepticism. We should be skeptical of certain things. We should challenge certain things. But some things, I mean, we just have to take for granted. We have to take for granted that our five senses are working. So like when an epistemic skeptic comes at me and says, we can't have knowledge, we can't have beliefs, we can't know our five senses are working, I always invoke something called epistemic particularism. And that's it. Unless you give me a good reason to doubt my five senses, unless you give me a good reason to doubt my cognitive faculties, I'm not going to. I have a good reason to doubt a theory of time. I mean, so I looked at the evidence and it seems like B theory of time is more likely. I would be able to doubt that. So that, I mean, the principle of credulity applies there as well. Because if we have good reason to doubt something that we start with, then we do it. Then we move on to some more better belief. I mean, if you and I had our memories wiped and we woke up on a desert island, we would intuitively think the earth is flat because we would look out and see it. If we somehow managed to build a satellite and send it up, we'd be like, oh, well, we have good reason to doubt this starting point we basically had. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from when it comes to this. So back, getting too far off track, going back to moral realism, why should we doubt in an ontological sense that moral facts are objective? What's a good reason to go in that direction?
Well, I'll have to take you back a second because I don't agree with you there. I think perhaps I think you might have misunderstood something I said, which is fairly crucial, actually.
Okay.
I'm not saying when I said that I didn't question my intuitions until I had reason to, I didn't mean to say that we should not question our intuitions unless we have good reason to, which is what you're trying to say here. What I meant by that is that there is no way that we can question those intuitions if we don't think to question those intuitions. So what I'm saying is that the Earth, for instance, if we had the intuition that the Earth is flat, you wouldn't even think to question that, perhaps. But if someone came along and just said, well, say, have you ever thought about the fact that it's possible that the Earth might not be flat? Then as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to accept the skeptical premise that you shouldn't take anything for granted, that's reason enough. That's my good reason. It's like, you know what, I haven't thought about that. And the whole point of skepticism is to think about everything in such a way that you don't take anything for granted. So if we have an intuition and someone comes along and just says something, just even brings it to mind, I think that's good enough reason in itself. So for instance, if someone says, say, have you ever thought about the fact that we might be living in a simulation? I mean, to me, that's good enough reason to consider it and to ask that question.
I agree.
You don't need to to take it any further than that. So the reason that I would, the good reason that I would say to doubt our intuition of morality is because we should doubt everything, and we've been made aware through moral reflection that perhaps we are wrong about morality, and perhaps there is no such thing as morality, or at least it makes no sense. So
well, I agree, but how so? So keep building on that.
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, I agree we shouldn't just take things for granted.
Okay, so well, let me put it this way: then. Would you accept that it is possible that that moral non-cognitivism is true?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible.
So if it's possible that it's true, then for me, there's your reason. That's why we should explore that idea and see if it makes logical sense, and then compare that against the position of moral realism, and see which seems to make more sense. I mean,
right.
that's fine for me.
I agree. I mean, I think we should evaluate and see if it makes sense. I mean, I've read Simon Blackburn. He argues quite extensively for his non-cognitivist views. I mean, he may not even call himself that anymore because he kind of jumps around a little bit here and there. But I mean, the question is that I'm not disagreeing with anything you said. I do think we should doubt. I do think that things are possible. I remember someone asked me, like, I mean, what if we one day found a tomb in the Middle East dated to like 33 AD when there's the body of a crucified man in it, and there was this on the outside, it said Jesus of Nazareth. Would you doubt Christianity? I said, absolutely, I would. I'm not just going to believe stuff just because it makes me feel good or because it's intuitive. I always say we need evidence for that. And that's why with moral realism, it starts from an intuitive case and we see how they manifest in reality. From where I'm coming from, it doesn't seem like there's any good reason to put forward a good non-cognitivist view because of things like moral progress, moral convergence, etc. Moral facts and duties tend to manifest in reality in objective ways like the laws of logic do. There are skeptics of logic. And as Thomas Nagel wrote in his book, The Last Word, that it's completely inconsistent. So a lot of the similar type of arguments can be put forward for moral realism. So I just want to know, what is a good reason to take a non-cognitivist view in this sense?
Okay, but you seem to be suggesting, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that the burden of proof lies with the person who's trying to deny the intuitive, the intuition.
Not necessarily. I mean, you have a burden of proof, and I agree. I do have some sort of burden of proof. But, I mean, at some point, there has to be a starting point from where we're going to go from here. If I say moral realism is true, it seems intuitive. You say, no, it isn't. And I would say, well, okay, well, here's some good reasons why it is. Look, if you and I came across someone who was raping, we would want to stop them. We would say that's objectively wrong. Justice has to be done. And what they're doing is just absolutely wrong and horrendous. We would not be like, well, that's just like their flavor of ice cream. Just because they like it, you know, doesn't mean we got to interfere. So, I mean, think of it from an evolutionary standpoint.
Why not? I know that sounds really odd, and you can ask questions when you're talking about philosophy that out of context would sound horrible, but why not?
Why not what?
Why would so I disagree with you when you say if we came across somebody raping someone, you said we'd want to stop them. Yes, we'd consider it to be wrong. Yes, we'd consider it to be objectively wrong. No, that's a different world. I'm saying, why would you say that it's different from a preference?
Well, think about it from like an evolutionary standpoint. So evolution has given us our taste preferences. We tend to like meat, cooked meat, because that's how we evolved. We also evolved to understand science, logic, mathematics. We also evolved to understand morality. However, all of these things have manifested slightly different. So our taste preferences, although from an evolutionary standpoint, they might be more important than morality, they are clearly subjective. No one doubts that. And so, but morality definitely manifests objectivity, manifests in an objective sense. So if that's how it tends to be understood between rational agents, if that's how it manifests within moral disagreement, moral convergence, moral experience, why should we take a different view? What is the good reason to go against that?
Well, because I don't think that saying we've evolved to experience morality as something that's objective is good enough reason to show that it is objective. It's like I would consider that the same thing has happened. It's like a preference of color, like our evolved ability to choose our preferences. It seems to me that even if morality is experienced differently, it's still the same thing. So you keep at this stage in the discussion, I would say that the burden of proof seems to lie with you, merely
Well,
because
let me ask.
at this stage of the discussion, I'm not necessarily trying to say that moral non-cognitivism is true. You're saying, I think that moral cognitivism is true. What's a good reason to doubt that? And if all I'm saying is doubt that, if all I'm saying is get to a stage where you're not saying that's true, as in you're sort of on the fence, you're agnostic about the issue, that leaves me with no burden of proof. So if you're asking me to give you a good reason to doubt your position, well, I don't have to at this stage in the conversation, because if I'm just trying to get you onto the fence, then for me that seems to be the logical starting point rather than the position I should have to pull you onto.
Well, I think the obvious response to that is possibility is not probability. Just because it could be possible that it's subjectivism or some form of non-cognitivism is true, that is not a good reason that it is probable true. That's where I would invoke particularism. I mean, to quote Richard Boyd, for example, let me quote Richard Boyd. In the sciences, we decide between theories on the basis of observation, which have an important degree of objectivity. It appears that in moral reasoning, moral intuitions play the same role which observations do in science. We test general moral principles and moral theories by seeing how their consequences conform or fail to conform to our moral intuitions in particular cases.
Yes,
so
the difference there's an important difference, and I don't mean to interrupt you there, Cameron. I'll let you jump in, but there's a really important difference there, which is that with science, we accept that there are certain things that we are taking for granted. So, for instance, we subjectively experience our senses to be true, and these are kind of assumptions that, like you say, we have to make in order to get anywhere. So,
well, I thought you said you were a skeptic. We got to doubt everything.
Well, I am, and I think we should doubt that. But what I'm saying is that in the field of science, the aim is to find out whether theories cohere with our understanding of nature. Okay, now with morality, you're absolutely right. We use reasoning and sometimes even observation to see if a moral proposition that we're making coheres with our moral intuition. I've got no problem with that. But what I'm saying is that moral intuition is just an intuition. That's not based in anything objective. Intuition is a subjective experience.
I agree, intuition's a subjective experience, but why would it not be based on anything objective? I mean, that's confusing the belief with the content of the belief.
No, I try to avoid doing this, and people seem to think I'm doing this. What I'm saying is that if you're going to test whether a moral proposition is true or false by seeing whether or not it contradicts your moral intuition, so it's like, does X conform with my moral intuition? Well, if you're acknowledging that your moral intuition is a subjective enterprise, then you're saying, does X conform with this subjective enterprise?
Well, we're not actually saying that. We're not saying, does it conform with my subjective experience or my intuition? I mean, that's, again, confusing epistemology with ontology. How we come to know moral facts and duties can be through intuition, or as Ruth Schaefer-Landau says, it's self-evident. That does not necessarily mean that's all it is. There still is objective facts beyond that from which we have a cognitive sense of. And that's a specific term they use quite often, is we have a cognitive sense of these. The intuition is not the morality. Our intuition is the cognitive sense of these moral facts, which Thomas Nagel just says it's a standard by which our intuitions can conform to, or our moral discourse can conform to. So we look at it like that. So just because we have intuitions, that does not mean that's all moral facts are.
I'll let Cameron jump.
Yeah. I just wanted to see if I could sort of summarize where we're at so far. I was just listening, and it's been really fun just to hear you guys go back and forth. But so, Alex, what I'm hearing you say, you're coming from a standpoint of skepticism. It's like we should be skeptical of basically anything that we believe. We should always be open to being wrong about it. And so that's like your fundamental principle, epistemological principle. This is where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the point of skepticism. And then we're applying it to morality. What I find interesting is that we're looking at this idea of like, possibly I'm wrong, therefore this like is enough in and of itself to doubt. I wanted to sort of talk about that a little bit more, because I think that does actually have a pretty big impact on the moral argument, especially with moral realism in the discussion so far, whether or not we can believe it just because it's sort of intuitively obvious. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Is that what you're saying? Well, that because it's possible that we're wrong about it, it's possible that it's not actually objective, and that it's not actually objectively wrong to murder and torture. And because it's possible that we're wrong, you're saying that's enough to sort of doubt it. And that applies in like any situation, any belief that we have, we should doubt it.
Well, I want to be careful here. It definitely depends on what you mean by doubt. What I'm trying to say is that in terms of discussing anything, and that includes morality, if you become aware of the fact that there's a possibility that you can be wrong, that's good enough reason to doubt it, in the sense that it's good enough reason to by doubt, what I mean there is I mean, I would see doubt as practically synonymous with the view that you might not be correct. So if you've become aware of the fact that you might not be correct about something, then immediately you have doubted it, if you see what I'm saying. And once you've doubted it, that doesn't mean that you're 50-50 on the fence. It just means that that's good enough reason to begin entertaining ideas as to how you may be wrong. That doesn't get you to the negation of your original intuition. All it does is it gets you to a point where you're willing to consider things that might lead you there. That's what I'm saying. So I think that we have very good reason to begin considering arguments, or begin questioning the arguments that we have in favor of our moral intuitions. And I'm not saying that will immediately get you to moral non-cognitivism, but I'm saying that we have very good reason to take a moment to reflect and say, okay, I have this moral intuition. I've just become aware that I might not actually be correct in this. So how am I justifying that I'm correct in this? Here is my argument. And you'll take something like the argument for moral realism and then evaluate whether or not that's justified. That's the point that I think we're at.
So let me throw an example out. This is a really common one in epistemology, which is to think about the reality of the past. So it's possible that the past is not real, that it's all an illusion, that it really, the Earth is only about 5 minutes old, and it just sort of has the appearance of age.
And actually, I just want to add something to that. There are actually now young Earth creationists that believe that when Adam and Eve sinned, that it changed all of the back history.
Well, so yeah, so here's the question though. So like, with the past, there's clearly a possibility. Like, I don't think anybody would deny that this is a possibility. It's possible that the world is only 5 minutes old, with the appearance of age, and so, and really, we don't have any other way of saying, well, yeah, it is actually, like, the past is real. Like, we have no other way of establishing that other than on the basis of, like, this just sort of seems to me that the past is real. Like, my memories don't seem like they're illusions made up, you know? So what, on what basis? Like, there is no other basis to me. And I guess I am kind of giving some of my own opinions here. It does seem to me that, like, that's all that we have in that case, just with this specific belief about the reality of the past. Like, we don't have anything else that we can draw from. We don't have any other, like, arguments or scientific evidence, because it sort of presupposes that the past is real. So in that case, do you think that the correct way to move forward with that belief, after we've questioned it, after we're like, okay, well, let's think about it, is the correct way forward in that to abandon that belief, to be skeptical about it? How should we treat that belief after we've realized that it's possibly false?
There's a lot to unpack there. I'm probably going to miss a few of the things that cropped up in my mind. So forgive me if I don't answer your question fully, and you can ask me for clarification. I think, like you say, we have an intuition of the past. We become aware of the fact that that intuition may be wrong. For me, that's good enough reason to doubt it. You already are doubting it. So you start to say, well, how do I justify my intuition that the past exists? And then you question that. And like you say, there really is there's no good criticism of that that's grounded in anything else. So like you say, it's all we have. Now, that's different from morality, because with morality, an objective basis for morality is not all we have. You can envision the situation, like, imagine by the end of this conversation I'd convinced you that morality was subjective. That doesn't really change anything, so to speak. So when you say that there's, in the case of believing that the past is completely false, but our intuition says that it's true, it's like, if you try to justify your intuition, then you're in the stage of doubting already, because you're trying to justify your intuition, and you find no good reason to doubt that. That's basically the argument from Credulity. It's like, if you have no good reason to doubt that intuition, then you should believe it. I would say that for all intents and purposes, you could move forward as though that's true, and as we do, that means that you really have to, if you want to be technical, say that I can never really know for a fact. But that seems to me to just be an unfortunate fact. It's like, if you were to ask me, did you go to sleep last night? I would say yes, but if you're asking me in this context, I suppose the only really intellectually honest answer I could give you is, well, I don't know, but I'll move forward on the presumption that I have. If you have any arguments against that, then I'm willing to hear them. What I would say is that the arguments that people have to justify their moral intuitions, or at least the arguments that people have to try to prove that their moral intuition is objectively true, I do have criticisms of those that are much stronger than any criticism you could have of the intuition that I went to sleep last night.
All right, I'll just ask one more question, and then I'm going to pass over to you, Michael, because this is not about me in this debate here. So in this case, so like let's think about someone else in this situation who thinks about your argument and is like, okay, the past it's possible the past is not real. Okay, and then should I give up that belief? Should I doubt it? And then they just think, well, that's silly. Of course the past is real. Like, is this person being irrational? Are they unjustified in their belief? You say that they don't know that they believe. I want to sort of leave that to the side, but let's talk about these other two terms. Are they still justified in their belief? Are they still rational in their belief? Or are they being like, is the person who does that, are they being irrational?
No, I think they're being inductively justifiable. It's like you have good inductive reason to believe it to be the case, and you have no real good inductive reason to doubt it's the case. Like if all you accept for philosophical certainty is deduction, then you would have to say that I don't know whether the past exists. But if you're allowing for some inductive proofs to hold some weight, then you could say that there's good inductive reasons to believe that the past exists, and there are no real good inductive reasons not to. So I don't think it's irrational or unjustifiable to just put that to the side and move on. I think that you're inductively justified, but I do think that it would be irrational to say that you're certain as a matter of epistemological fact.
Yeah, well, and I don't think that Michael's saying that, or yeah, you're not saying
no,
that.
I don't doubt that.
Absolutely certain
but
about
in this example of somebody just saying, well, I'm just going to sort of ignore that and move on, and just say that the past did exist and I'm certain that the past existed, I'd say that would be irrational from a deductive and philosophical standpoint, but not irrational from an inductive standpoint.
Yeah, so I wasn't saying that they'd be like certain of it, but they would just sort of continue believing it, and they would. The question there would be, are they still justified in that belief? Not necessarily that they would like go on and be certain about it. There's a thing in epistemology called infallibilism, and I think a lot of epistemologists are actually they hold that view. And infallibilism is just the idea that we don't have to be absolutely certain about our beliefs, and we can still have a whole lot of knowledge about a lot of stuff. But I'll put that to the side, and let's talk a little more about. So let me ask you, Michael. Do you have another argument that you want to sort of present in defense of moral realism?
Well, I mean, I've kind of
maybe move the conversation up.
And I can talk about moral progress, for example. It's a pretty common argument that a lot of moral philosophers use. I mean, we tend to think that we're doing far better than the Roman Empire did because we're not crucifying people, we're not torturing people to death, we're not under the assumption that Romulus has given us the code that it's our job to go out and conquer the world, and that's the morally right thing to do. So we tend to look at that in terms of form of moral progress. If you want to say, so here's another good example. I mean, on your Twitter page, Alex, you have at the top a pinned post where you say separate, I don't remember exactly where, but separate, church and state. If that's a good thing that we've moved beyond theocracies, that would be an example of moral progress, something that we ought to do. It's better for society. It's the good thing to do. So if that's true, then moral progress definitely seems to suggest that we ought to move more towards an objective understanding of morality, or more towards we're moving in an objective way in a moral sense, that these things are good and we should try to obtain them independent of how some people might feel. If someone disagrees with a certain moral claim, then they're wrong, and we ought to reject that and focus on what is actually good. So when it comes to moral progress, there is another way that moral facts manifest in reality that tend to show objectivity.
It's an interesting way to look at it. It kind of has a whiff to me of the argument for God's existence from degree, degrees of perfection. It seems similar in that sense. It's like if you're moving towards, if you're going to say you have progress, then there should be something you're moving towards. I suppose that's the crux of what you're saying there, if I haven't gotten that wrong. So there are two ways I can approach this. The first is to say something along the lines of, well, if I subjectively thought that blue was the best color, that was my opinion, and one of my rooms in my house was painted blue, I might say that that was progress. I'd say that this is good. I'm glad that this has happened. This is better than yesterday, and we're moving towards a situation where my whole house is blue. That doesn't mean it's not subjective that painting the room blue is a good thing. But also, I would say that in the sense of moral progress, the way that I would say that we're better, so to speak, moving forward, like the abolition of slavery, let's say, is not necessarily because that was a move towards an objective moral standpoint, but because it was a move towards what I would call philosophical consistency. So the reason that this is where I'm going to have to take a moment to kind of outline a bit more of my moral philosophy, in that I think that there's a good reason why we feel that morality is objective, even if it's not. And that's because there are certain subjective assumptions that we do all share. And when you all agree on something, when there's universal agreement, it's difficult to practically distinguish that from objectivity. It's as though everybody in the entire world agreed that blue were the best color. Then I could say, yes, you should get a blue car. That would still be subjective because we all subjectively think that blue is the best color, but I can still say that you should get a blue car. Now, if it were the case that it were objectively true that blue were the best color, the result would be the same. So it makes sense that we would evolve in such a way as to think that blue is objectively the best color, even if it isn't, because we all agree on it. Now, I think that this is where Sam Harris has something good to say, which is that we all, for instance, experience pain as bad. That's something we all experience. Now, that to me is still a subjective experience, but because we all agree on it, we can almost treat morality as though it's objective. So if we all think that pain is bad, or our experience, we experience pain as bad, and I can show you that doing X will bring about your pain, then I can say that doing X is bad, so to speak, not with reference to objective reality, but with reference to your own subjective intuition. So in the same sense, what we're moving towards is not an objective standing point of morality, but philosophical consistency with our own subjective intuitions. Now, I can't prove whether those subjective intuitions are true or false, but that's what we're moving towards.
So back you up a little bit. You were talking about how we sort of like evolved to get to that point where we had to sort of think it. Do you think if everyone in the world thought that veganism was wrong, that would be objectively bad? Like, do you think we would all think that's objectively bad? Well, that was my point right there, is that of course we don't. If everyone in the room thought everyone in the world thought blue was the best color, no one would say that's objectively true. And anyone who thinks green is the best color should serve at least 5 to 10 years in prison. We'd be like, that's absurd. That's not an objective. It's not an objective.
Well, no, that you wouldn't necessarily know that's absurd, and this is what I'm saying. It would be difficult to distinguish it. If we really had all evolved to have this inbuilt intuition that blue was the best color, then anybody who said that it wasn't, we'd say that you're wrong. How could you possibly think that? It's very difficult to distinguish between something being objectively true and something being a subjective, universal expression of intuition. So this is why I think that the illusion is so strong.
I don't think so, because I think by your example, you kind of showed that certain things we think we know are subjective, like colors or taste preferences or diets. We understand that's subjective, and diet is far more important from an evolutionary standpoint, and yet we still think that's pretty subjective.
Well, that depends what you mean. What do you mean diet is subjective?
Well, I mean, if someone wants to be a vegetarian versus someone wants to eat paleo or someone wants to eat vegan, we obviously don't think someone's doing something objectively wrong if they want to be a vegan, even though our ancestors weren't vegans.
Well, they might be objectively wrong in the sense that if they value, let's say, health, and we could objectively demonstrate that one meal was more conducive to health than another, then we could say to them, you should have that meal.
Well, that's not so much as a value, that's more of a description. I mean, there's a huge difference between descriptions in nature and prescriptions, what we're talking about.
Sure, so this is what I'm trying to say, that I don't think there is that difference. I think that saying you should not kill is the same as saying you should not get a green car.
Well, that's a prescription is what you're saying. That's not a description. A prescription would be say you ought not get a green car. Yeah. But we understand that's a subjective preference. When it comes to ethics, we don't look at those as subjective preferences. Those manifest in reality as if they're objectively true.
Well, I do. It's like, how can you justify if everybody in the world did agree intuitively and couldn't explain why, but just knew like morality, just knew that blue was just good. Blue is just the best color. blue is the best color, can't explain why, but we all agree that that's the case, then I can say you ought not get a green car.
But now, if everyone in the world thought that, would you think that someone should be brought to justice if they got a green car?
No, not necessarily.
Well, exactly. That's where the difference is between ethics and color preference.
Right, but if somebody getting a green car somehow impinged on someone else being able to achieve something that they wanted to do. So let's say that by somebody getting a green car, they contaminated the supply, and now all the cars or a bunch of cars were going to turn out green. Then it may be the case that we, knowing that blue is best and green is bad, we would say, well, we need to deter that person from doing that. And so there's a very good chance that we would be in a position where we would say, no, we should put that person in jail to stop them doing that, so as not to make other people suffer. And this is what I think the criminal justice system is based upon. And we have to be careful here, because I think I can preempt perhaps what you're about to say, which is, well, doesn't that mean then that when we throw someone in jail for doing something immoral, so to speak, we are not really justified in doing that? Well, I don't think on a philosophical level you can demonstrate that you are justified in doing that. It's like, I would say with every fiber of my being, I experience things like rape as wrong, but I just cannot show that that is objectively wrong. And so the only way that I can justify locking someone up is with reference to the universal subjective recognition that, say, pain is bad, linking rape to that, and then saying, well, look, Mr. Rapist, you agree that you experience pain as bad. And if I can make a link between rape and that pain, then I can show that they are wrong, but only ever with reference to that subjective experience of pain.
Well, so pain is, you're referencing a subjective experience of pain. So would exercise be objectively bad? Because that can cause a lot of pain. I know from experience that causes pain, but we don't think that that's bad.
Well, let's be careful. I'm not saying that it is objectively wrong to kill if it
you're referencing the subjective thing of pain, but that doesn't necessarily equate to ethics, because you can have pain without ethics. I mean,
it depends. It depends how you're defining pain. It's like in the case of exercise, you're sort of contrasting pleasure and pain, and you've got a situation where, yes, okay, you could say that there is some pain in exercise, but that would be outweighed by the pain that you would experience in a long-term obesity, let's say. So it's kind of it's a weighing up, and this is where moral. Well, I don't want to say moral. This is where reasoning can come in. So, in the same way that morality is kind of an enterprise not just of intuition, but we sort of use observation and we use reasoning to determine, are we really acting morally? In the same way, you might say, well, we all experience pain as bad, and when I go to exercise, it hurts. So, you know, I feel like I shouldn't be doing that. Well, you could reason that actually you'll experience more pain in the long run by not exercising and getting obese, and therefore it is better for you to exercise. But you can therefore only say you should exercise based on the assumption that you want to achieve health, and that's fine.
That's just a normative ought. I wouldn't say that's a moral ought, that we ought to exercise or we ought to diet or we ought to not get obese. Those are normative oughts, and those are pretty subjective. If somebody,
I don't see the difference.
Okay, so let me ask you this then. If somebody said, I want to be the fattest person on planet Earth, I'll pay for my own health care, it won't cause anyone any other pain, I'm just going to do that. Would we say that that's bad? They need to be thrown in jail. Justice has to be done. That's wrong. No one should do that. I mean, the answer would be no. If someone says, I want to be a rapist, I want to go out and rape, that's objectively wrong. These are manifesting in different ways.
How are you justifying that? Like you just said that somebody raping is objectively wrong. Like, how do you know that?
Well, again, it goes back to what, David Brink, Kai Nelson, Ruth Schaefer knows. This is objectively wrong. This is an intuitive starting point. You even admitted to me just a couple minutes ago that with every fiber of your being, you feel that this is wrong. It has to be stopped. And again, actions speak louder than words. So if this is its intuitive or starting point, if our actions are manifesting in that way, if our moral discourse is manifesting in that way, why should we doubt it and take a subjective view? I've yet to hear one good argument to doubt this and go to subjectivism. So far, all you've said is basically that, well, we could doubt it. It could be wrong. And I agree it could be wrong, but I want to see a good reason for why. I mean, I'm going to stand with Richard Boyd on this, that unless you're going to give me a good reason, there's no reason to somehow overthrow our entire understanding of moral discourse in this. And that's why the arguments for moral realism has persuaded so many philosophers as of late, because there just hasn't been a good alternative presented that can overtake this from that point.
So, well, let me put it this way to you. Would you agree that everybody experiences pain as bad? Taking the definition of pain that I've tried to expel. Okay, so why would you say not?
Okay, can you give me the definition again, because it kind of got a
Yes.
little mumbled in there. So go
Just
ahead.
want to be careful. So a lot of people say, well, that's not true because there are people who enjoy pain, you know, perhaps in a sexual way or something. But what I would say to that is, well, then that's not really pain. What I mean by pain is like discomfort kind of pain. So if you enjoy what other people would call pain, that's not really pain in the sense that I'm using the word.
Well, I mean, you can. I don't know if that's necessarily a good definition, because you can be uncomfortable exercising. I was uncomfortable in basic training, but I would consider it a good thing for my mental health and whatnot.
Right, but you experience that pain even when exercising, knowing that there's a greater good. You still experience that pain in isolation as bad. If you didn't, then you wouldn't be giving it as an example here. Like, you recognize that pain is experienced as a bad thing, even if it's
a feeling that we experience. Yeah,
yeah, it's a feeling we experience as bad. Yeah,
I wouldn't say it's necessarily bad.
Even if you reason that this bad feeling, that this uncomfortable feeling, this thing that I'm experiencing as bad, is vastly outweighed by the benefits that will give me for going through it.
Well, don't equate general badness with moral badness. I can say I got a bad car.
That's not what I'm doing.
I can say that I experienced badness when I exercise, but that's not moral badness. I mean, so we have to distinguish between those.
So how would you define good and bad morally? How would you define good and...
Well, as you quoted, you know, you're reading G. Moore, I agree with him. These are indefinable. Okay. You can't, they're irreducible. So there's three ways to view moral properties. You can be you can say that you can eliminate them. You can hold to an identity theory, or you can be a non-reductionist. I'm a non-reductionist, so I'm not going to define them into smaller parts.
But if you can't define bad, then how can you distinguish different types of bad? That's not a challenge. I'm just interested to see how you do that. So what would you say, let me word it this way, is the difference between saying that when I put my hand on a stove, this is another favorite of Harris's, when I put my hand on a stove, bad, what's the difference between that kind of bad and moral bad? Just so we're on the same page here.
Okay, well, to use your analogy from your video, it's like colors. You know, I know the difference between yellow and blue, although I can't necessarily explain it in that sense. I mean, if I'm going to try, one is going to cause moral discord. You know, one's has moral status, one simply doesn't. So we have to remember from reading G. Moore, as I suppose you have, that these are irreducible, irredefinable. They're not definable, but that doesn't mean we don't know the differences.
Sure. Okay, that's fine. So what I'm really trying to get at with the pain example, for instance, this is something Harris tries to get at, is less to me in this avenue of the discussion, it's less pertinent as to what we mean by good and bad, and we're more trying to get to should and shouldn't, because for me, morality has a lot more to do with should and should not than it does to have to do with good or bad. It's
a big part of it, but it's not entirely. Like, for example, we can say cooperation is a good thing, but it doesn't mean we ought to always be cooperative. It's just we can value it, but you know, there's a difference between values and duties. That's why we always talk about values and duties.
So let's follow the example, because would you say that you need both in order to have morality?
You mean to have, like, actually have morality within reality, I guess you could say.
Yeah, like does morality entail both values and duties?
Yeah, they're definitely parts of morality, the duties and values.
And you need both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so
have moral discussion. Yeah.
Let me say then, for the purposes of this discussion, I probably have more problem with the idea of duty than the idea of value.
Okay.
So trying to get to the bottom of duty, let's follow this example. So would you grant that, okay, let's isolate this. So there's a person who experiences pain as bad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's an objective fact that person experiences pain as bad. It's also an objective fact that person wishes to avoid that which is bad.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make it objectively true that they should avoid X?
That's just a description. That's not the prescription itself.
Right. So, I mean, that's kind of the crux of my argument. It's like, you cannot say that you should do something, even if it's an objective fact that we intuit things as good, and it's an objective fact that we want what's good, you can't say that it's an objective fact that we should do what's good.
Well,
and I think if you're going to have objective morality, you need to be able to do that.
Well, that's the thing, is that what you just described would not even be remotely close to what we mean when we're talking about objective values and duties. That's just a description of reality. That's one of the problems with natural moral realism that everyone always brings up. Just in the description itself, you cannot derive the ought. The ought seems like it's something extra. So just because it's not in the description, that does not mean there's not objective oughts. It seems that you sort of assume the conclusion you want. All there is descriptions. There are no prescriptions. Therefore, there are no prescriptions.
Can I get some clarification real quick, Alex? So do you believe that there are good and like objectively good and bad things?
It depends on what you mean by good and bad. But I would say that doesn't necessarily matter, because I would grant you, for instance, and this is one of the points that I brought up in the religious video that I made, I would grant you that there are things that are objectively good and objectively bad. Like, I could grant you that, but that wouldn't necessarily grant that you should do what's good and you shouldn't do what's bad.
Right. I would agree with that. So there's an example that I came across the other day about, like, it's a good thing if you were to become a doctor, right? But you're not like morally obligated to become a doctor. Right. So I think Michael and I think we're sort of in agreement with that. Like, the moral values don't get you necessarily to moral duties. However, what I would say to me is that it looks like if we're going to be able to justify the existence of moral values, like, we would justify the existence of moral obligations in the same exact way. Like, it would primarily be through the.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah.
Can I try and break this down then? So this might sound a silly question, but if it is good to be a doctor, then why isn't there an obligation to be a doctor?
Well, it's because there are values and there are duties. They're not the same. You cannot equate them. That's why we always talk about them.
You said that it would be morally virtuous to do so.
Yeah, we value such a thing.
Okay,
but that does not mean I'm obligated to.
I'm not disagreeing with you here, and I would say the same, but I'm trying to get to why we think this. So why is it that we think this? Like, why is there no obligation to do that which is good? Like, surely if someone were to become a doctor, it would be better. And so why is it not a moral obligation that they should become a doctor?
Well, because it just goes back to some of the examples you were using. It's self-evident. These things just simply are. As you said, I mean, yellow just is yellow. We cannot reduce it to something else. So under non-natural moral realism, moral values and duties are irreducible.
I'm trying to figure out how best to kind of break this down, because there's something lying at the kind of base of this idea that if it's good to be a doctor, that doesn't mean you have an obligation to be a doctor. I think that if you can say that, then you can say that ultimately or you could make a case that there is no obligation. So why would you say, for instance, it's not an obligation to chase being a doctor, even though that's good? But whereas, let's say, would you say that if you see somebody drowning, like a child drowning in 5-foot swimming pool that you can just walk across, do you have an obligation to help that child?
Absolutely, yeah.
So what's the difference? Why in one case is there an obligation and why not in the other?
Okay, well, for one, if I don't become a doctor, I'm not going to harm anyone. I can be a good, as Cameron is a photographer, and it's not going to cause harm. It's not going to.
No, but it will, because the person that, like, for instance, the person at the last line at the doctor's surgery at the NHS won't be able to get their service because you didn't become a doctor and there's not enough doctors to go around.
Well, that's a specific scenario. That's assuming that, if you're the only one left. It's sort of like the same type of obligation. If you need to become a doctor because let's say, like, I don't know, an angel shows up and says, in the future, there's going to be a doctor shortages. You need to be a doctor. You're obligated to. That's kind of a different, because our understanding of the circumstances has changed. And therefore the obligation, of course, changes. So we have to understand, sort of like a math equation. If I say 2 + 2 = 4, But then the circumstances change. I add another 3 in there. Well, then it's 3 plus 2 plus 2 equals 7. So the solution is always going to be different depending on the circumstances of the moral situation.
Here's another way to look about it. Sorry, Alex. I'm jumping in a lot.
No, go ahead. It's great. It's fine.
So I think that these moral values, and when we're thinking about obligations and stuff, and what sort of helps us distinguish in the one case, like, I don't need to be a doctor in the current position that I am, in the circumstances that I live, in the society that I live in, America and everything. It's because there are a lot of other doctors. There's a lot of different ways that you could go, and in a different situation, maybe things would be different. But I think it's what sort of explains the difference is that there's more fundamental moral truths, moral obligations and stuff that sort of drive us that way. For instance, if there was a shortage of doctors, then some more fundamental moral truth is going to be guiding me that way. In like, it's I ought to be saving, just like the example that you gave, a child drowning. It's sort of the same thing. Like, that's a sort of fundamental moral truth, is that it would apply in the same other situation where you're the only person that can be a doctor in the society, in this culture, or whatever. Like, you've got an obligation to save lives. So it sort of relies on these more fundamental moral truths, and that's going to guide us. And then the circumstances, the surrounding situation is going to change that based on what's sort of included in the scenario that we're thinking about. But the point I'm making is that it sort of falls back to these more fundamental moral truths.
Yeah, but this is something that really needs to be unpacked. We need to get to the bottom of this. I think if you want to understand where I'm coming from, we really need to get to the bottom of why one thing has a moral obligation and one does not. For instance, if you're going to say there is no shortage of doctors, so there's no real bad, there's nothing bad that happens if you don't become a doctor, why are you saying that it is good to become a doctor?
So why are we saying that it is good to become a doctor?
Yeah, like, why is that good?
Okay, because it's a value that we would have. It's like friendship or cooperation. These are valuable things, even though they're not necessarily obligatory upon us. Basically what we're basically saying is you can value certain things without feeling that you're obligated by them. So that's why there's a difference between values and duties.
Like, is it good to become a carpenter?
It's a valuable thing. Yeah, we can value that.
What is it good? Like, you say that becoming a doctor is good, but becoming a carpenter is like, well, it's valuable. Like,
well, I would ask you the circumstances for that specific carpenter. So in normative ethics, I would call myself a virtue ethicist.
Okay.
And so what we would say within certain normative cases like this, they're really quite, in the real world setting, they're quite messy. There are no like just always do this, always do that, like you may have in some sort of forms of deontology. So, I mean, we would say we're trying to obtain these certain values in society. And so just because, if someone says you ought to become a carpenter, I would need to know more of the circumstantial settings.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Okay, and also going on that, we're getting, as I just want to say, we're getting more into like normative ethics. What are we supposed to do? We can have, I mean, you could be a moral realist and be a utilitarian. You can be a moral realist and be a virtue ethicist. Those are different things in that sense. We're trying to understand in this conversation, what are they? Not what are the oughts, what are the specifics in that?
Yeah, and the way that I'm trying to do that is by finding the difference between a moral obligation and a moral virtue. So what I would say, I'll try and just spell this out. I don't know if I'll be able to do this very well, because this is a thought that's just occurred to me now. So to say that becoming a doctor is good, I think that the reason why we think that becoming a doctor is good is because it is conducive to saving lives and helping lives, which we experience which we think is a good thing. Now, for the moment, it doesn't matter whether that's objective or not, because again, we're talking about the duty rather than the value. So let's just grant that we value saving of lives as good, whether that's subjective or objective. The reason that I think we would say that it's good to become a doctor is because it saves lives. So in that instance, if there were no shortage of doctors, if it really were the case that you becoming a doctor makes no difference to how many people get saved or don't get saved, I don't think I would say that it's necessarily good to become a doctor. But let's say that, let's take a situation where there is a shortage of doctors, like there is in my country. Is it good to become a doctor? Well, let's say yes. Is there therefore a moral obligation to become a doctor? Well, most people would say no, you wouldn't have to become a doctor just because there's a shortage.
Mm-hmm.
But then you'd also say that if you were the only doctor who could do the job, then perhaps you would have a moral obligation. So where do we draw that line, and how do we justify drawing that line?
Well, again, that's
to me, it seems that the only reason that we're able to say that you don't have a moral obligation to become a doctor is because we could say, well, to me, it's a balance of virtues. It's not to do with whether or not becoming a doctor is good or bad. Like you say, it has to be looked at situationally. And the only way that we would the only way that we would be able to distinguish whether something is an obligation or whether it's not, is whether there are other obligations that outweigh it. Like our obligation for to respect liberty is stronger than our obligation to become a doctor when there's a shortage. But maybe our obligation to become a doctor when you're the only doctor would outweigh the obligation to respect personal liberty, which would have to, if you're going to say that would be a moral obligation. But you're just balancing obligations. You're just balancing obligations.
I get exactly what you're saying, and that's a great discussion in normative ethics. But notice what you're kind of doing within a meta-ethical standpoint. You're talking about these things as if they are objectively true in some sense. Now, I know you don't think they are, but it's extremely hard for you to look at these things as if so. You would say it seems wrong for me to force people to become doctors. And so that's from a meta-ethical standpoint, getting back into meta-ethics, regardless of their normative status. Okay. We seem to be referring to these things in an objective standpoint. But that goes back to my original point, though, that intuitively, self-evidently, these things are objective. These things are not things that are sort of manifesting in a way that seems subjective. If some culture wants to force people to be doctors, well, that's just their preference. We say that's morally wrong in that standpoint.
It's philosophical consistency rather than moral realism. I say that forcing people to become doctors is wrong, not as an objective matter of fact, but because if you had to break it down, so for instance, I subjectively value my liberty. Why? I don't know. It's subjective as far as I'm concerned. I just subjectively enjoy liberty. I can't back that up. I can't prove that it's an objective truth that you should grant me my liberty, but I think it's a good thing. Not objectively, of course, not objectively.
Do you think we ought to be philosophically consistent? Like, do you think it'd be a bad thing if there was a philosopher that was not philosophically consistent in a sense of justice? Do you think that
only on the subjective assumption that we want to have a productive conversation? And besides, like you say, if someone did misrepresent your argument or something, you wouldn't throw them in jail. So if you're going to use that line of argument to defend moral realism, then I'd have to be able to use that other line of reasoning.
That's what I'm getting at. You're talking about we should be philosophically consistent, but you're not. You agree with me, as you with everyone else. That's not something that is morally objective. That's not something that someone should be brought to justice if they fail to do it. That's just a normative ought that can be subjective in a lot of ways. So why is it that when we say someone rapes, they ought to be thrown in jail? They have done something they should never do. They have done something that requires justice. And so it's a little bit different than saying that we ought to be philosophically consistent. Well, I'm trying to see how you're trying to go from moral realism is intuitive to we ought to be philosophically consistent. These are different thoughts.
Because like I was saying, it's a balance of virtues. So like you say, if I misrepresent your argument, then that's immoral, you might say, but you wouldn't throw me in jail for it. Well, what if me representing your argument caused you to be fired by the company you worked for because I misrepresented something you'd said? Well, maybe you'd sue me for libel. So maybe then you would want me to be brought to justice, because your subjective value of well-being in terms of your livelihood is stronger than any kind of value you could have, or let's say that would suddenly constitute you saying there should be some repercussion. Now it's the same thing, it's the same situation. All I'm doing is misrepresenting your argument, but because it's had an effect on something else that we subjectively value, we can say that person should be thrown in jail. So in the same sense, raping somebody, if that were a victimless crime, then we wouldn't throw them in jail. But it's not a victimless crime. It has a victim. And that means we have to balance the value of personal liberty of the victim and the value of the personal liberty of the perpetrator, and a bunch of other very minute factors that all get thrown together. And we come out with the conclusion that our value of that victim's liberty is stronger than our value for that person's sexual desire. Now, why is that stronger? Why is that stronger than the other? We just subjectively experience it as so. I'm not going to say that it's objectively stronger. It just, we all or at least
You're
most of us
almost there. I feel like you're almost where we're trying to get at there. So
I am almost there, but you can't make that final step. That's the thing. I'm edging round.
I completely agree. I can't make that final step. I completely agree, as all the moral philosophers I quoted basically agree. But I mean, going back to Richard Boyd, I mean, it says like this is, in sciences we decide between certain series of observations. I can't prove to you B theory of time is true, but that does seem like it's the most likely case. It's the best explanation of how these things are manifesting, of what we're discussing is. Same within this moral discourse. The best explanation, even though everything is experienced objectively, but you're talking about values. You're talking about these things. You basically are saying we ought to be, we balance this virtuous view. Well, why? Why should we obtain these certain virtues? That's spoken as if it's some sort of objective setting that we have to do.
So, Alex,
going back to the moral philosophers, that's just their basic point. If that's basically what moral realism is manifesting, our moral discourse is manifesting in that way, why is that not the best explanation of morality?
I'd like to get to the other premise to the moral argument, whether or not God is necessary. So, Alex, give your response here, and then we'll move on.
And I'd also like to say that, because I've been on the other end of this, if I say something and then we move on, I'd like nobody watching to take that as Michael agreeing with me. I understand that when you get the last word, it's kind of annoying because but let me put this case to you. So I would say that you don't have the best reason to justify. So what you seem to be saying is that we experience morality as objective.
We experience, we intuit, we discuss. That's all the way.
And you're saying, what's the best explanation for that? And you're saying that you think the best explanation for that is that they are objective. So that's fair to say. But what I would say is that it makes perfect sense that there is no reason to there's no problem with the line of reasoning that would suggest that evolutionarily it makes sense that rather than experiencing morality, even if it were a subjective enterprise, if we evolved in such a way to experience it as objective, we'd be more fervent in our morality. And if having a morality helps us as a species to survive, then it would make sense that those who experience morality as objective would survive, and those who experience morality as subjective would suffer for it. Now, for me, that is a perfectly good explanation of why the species has evolved such that we all experience and talk about morality as though it's objective. Because
I want to ask you one quick question about that, and then please keep going.
Okay.
Why wouldn't it also be that why would it also be that diets and taste preferences are not manifested objectively?
I was about to get there because of the fact that does not carry the same weight when it comes to survival. It's like if you subjectively favor being not hungry to being hungry, and you wouldn't say that that's an objective fact. You could say that your taste preference in terms of being hungry or not hungry, like you'd prefer to not be hungry. Fair enough. That doesn't need to be an objective impulse, or that doesn't need to be objectively reasoned for you to pick up and eat the meat that's in front of you. Whereas if you're talking about morality, which endures some kind of loss, it's like if you're going to be a morally virtuous person, that is not of benefit to you a lot of the time, although evolutionarily it is, but the thinking conscious being doesn't know that. So you incur some kind of cost. The person who thinks that there is an objective reason to do it is more likely to do it. Whereas when you've got something like taste, or when you've got something like color or whatever, you don't need that kind of, because you're not incurring a loss in the same way, you don't need that objective experience in order to... You don't
think you're losing something if you don't eat?
Well, yes, but what I'm saying is that even if you just experience that pain of hunger as subjective, that's enough to make you eat. Whereas if you just experience morality as subjective, that might not be enough to make you act morally. And if you need that moral acting and you need that eating in order to survive as a species, if you can get by as a species with a subjective experience of hunger and that allows you to survive, then that's all you need, and you'll have no reason to evolve an objective understanding of hunger. If having a subjective understanding of morality is not as strong or doesn't help you to survive in the same way that an objective understanding of morality does, and you need that objective experience to move forward as a species, then it does make sense for that to have evolved.
I'm kicking myself because it seems like toward the beginning of this discussion, Alex, you mentioned the term emotivism in metaethics, but it sounds like you've been talking like a subjectivist in the sense of like moral statements are really just descriptions of our attitudes, and like I like this or I don't like this. Whereas emotivism, on the other hand, says that a moral statement is an expression of an emotion. Like when I say shoplifting is bad or shoplifting is wrong, I'm really saying on emotivism, like that's not a truth or false. That's not a truth or false statement. So I'm curious. Like, are you more of a subjectivist? Are these like descriptions of our attitudes, or is this expression like on emotivism?
There are two reasons why, and I don't know, you were breaking up a bit there. I don't know if I missed something. I don't know if that was my internet or yours. I don't know if Michael, you got that.
No, you were breaking up too, Cameron.
Okay, that's fine. So
yeah,
there are two ways that we can kind of approach this idea of why I might have sort of said one thing and expressed the other. The first is that perhaps I don't have the same understanding of words like emotivism and subjectivism as you do. I highly doubt that I've familiarized myself as much with their different incantations as you both have. So there's a possibility that I've said emotivism when really I meant subjectivism, perhaps. But what I would say is I think the confusion is perhaps lying in, to me, there's a difference between saying, what do people mean when they say something is good or bad, and then the discussion of how that experience arised. So from the evolutionary standpoint, I'm trying to explain why we experience good and bad. And I would say that the reason that experience has come about is because it's helped us to survive as a species. But when you're sat there saying that something is good or bad, that's not what you're thinking about. That may be the reason for which the morality has come about, but there's a different, that's not what you're thinking about when you're saying that something is good or bad.
Have you heard of Dirk Upham's?
I haven't.
Okay, he was in a prison in medieval time, in around the Renaissance times, and he escaped from this prison. And as he was running across the icy water, a guard saw him and started chasing after him. The guard fell through the ice. Now he turned, went back, pulled the guard out. The guard immediately arrested him. He was executed a couple days later. Do you think it was morally right for him to pull it out? Now, if morality just evolved objectively to help us survive, then that should have been objectively wrong. Same with if we rescue like an animal in the wood. Like if I rescued a jaguar, because I live in Arizona, we actually have a couple here. There's like one or two. But if I rescued it and then I knew it was going to kill me after, why would I feel that's objectively right to do, even though that's not helping me survive? So morality, it doesn't necessarily manifest in a way that always helps us survive, yet we still feel it's objective. So that's kind of where I'm not really seeing where you're coming from.
Yeah, I can answer that, but it would take a lot of unpacking again.
That's fine. I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's really interesting, actually, that the example you've given there, because what I would say is that because morality is a subjective enterprise, it's like, how can I phrase this? To say whether or not that person pulling out the guy from the falling through the ice is morally right or wrong, you have to understand my moral framework is one that can be treated as though it's objective, because there are certain things that we all agree with, like the experience of pain as bad, as long as you take pain to mean what I mean to mean by pain. We all experience pain as bad, and therefore if I can make a link between X and the experience of pain, I can say that we shouldn't do X. Even though I recognize that's a subjective enterprise, it's still something we can agree on. So
do you think it's possible that like maybe evolution didn't give us morality, but maybe evolution just gave us the ability to understand objective morality? Like we can understand, because would that be a possibility? Like maybe evolution didn't give us our morality, but it gave us our ability to understand. Like this is Thomas Nagel's point. Evolution gave us our ability to understand what's objectively true, as in terms of like logic and science. Could that not also just be as equally possible from evolution?
Absolutely. But could it not be also the case that rather than evolution producing just the intuition of hunger, evolution provided us the ability to intuit the objective fact of hunger?
Well, we don't say that it's objectively wrong to be hungry. If somebody
I'm not talking about wrong or right. I'm talking about, so this might sum up, or it's interesting. I haven't answered your previous question. I'll try and get to it, but to just dispel with this first, it's like you saying, well, have we evolved to experience good and bad? Like have we evolved in such a way that's produced this thing we called morality in our minds, or have we evolved in such a way to facilitate our understanding of morality which exists independently? To me, that's like asking the question, well, have we evolved to produce this experience we call hunger, or have we evolved to be able to recognize this thing called hunger which exists objectively independent of humans? To me, that makes no sense. It's like, how could you say that we've evolved to recognize and understand hunger which exists objectively?
Well, I wouldn't say that. Like, I get what you're saying.
Exactly, you wouldn't say that, but for the exact same reason, I wouldn't say that about morality either.
Well, I mean, I think at this point we can move on. I think we've kind of
But so then to answer the question about the guy falling through the ice, it's like, if you could demonstrate, the first thing is, like I say, for something to be objectively good or bad, if it could be objectively good or bad, that doesn't necessarily entail that you can demonstrate it to be so. So it could be that if I knew all the facts, or could know all the facts, I could say that based on my subjective assumptions, I would say that subjectively that person did a bad thing. Even if that were possible in principle, that doesn't mean I could necessarily make that judgment. But let's assume that I did have access to every single fact about the situation, you know, down to the atom. Well, I could say that if I'm going to say that we all experience pain as bad, and we all also have the subjective impulse to avoid that which is bad. And I can say that if we have a dysfunctional society, objectively, that leads to more people experiencing what is bad. Then I can say that if I can show that objectively, by this action, we've led to a more ordered or disordered society, then it was objectively good or bad. So like, if the guy pulling out the security guy from under the ice, if his subsequent execution actually did improve the well-being of society, and that would include things like the morality of the death penalty, which is not to be ignored, then I think that from a neutral standpoint, you could perhaps say that yes, that was a moral thing to do, but only if you know all of the facts. And even then, if you could, I'd still see it as a subjective enterprise.
Okay, so let's if we can just leave that one there, and if you need to, Michael, just produce a video later on in response.
Yeah, I'd love some more time to think about that before answering it anyways. Yeah.
Well, I mean, earlier on, that your question about the difference between the doctor situation, I thought that was a really interesting question. I'd like to think more about that one too.
I'd like to. Now that I've thought of it, I'd like to put that into a more coherent fashion, and perhaps I'll produce a video or something on it just to demonstrate, because I didn't get to the point that I was sort of trying to make there, and I don't know that I could. So
no worries.
If people were interested in that, you know, then they can keep their eyes peeled for some even if they know that they're going to immediately disagree. It may exist at some point in the short-term future.
Well, these thoughts brought to you by Capturing Christianity. All right, so let's go to the second part, and we only have about a half an hour left, so we'll see what we can do in that time. So this thought that morality, if it exists, is necessary in some way on God. Let's talk about that. So what's your approach to that, Michael? How do you sort of start to think about this?
Okay, well, if we, for the sake of argument, we'll just get past the whole if moral realism is true or false. I mean, obviously, for the moral argument to work, moral realism has to be true. So basically, we start out with understanding that this is clearly a rational enterprise. I just think this discussion has kind of just showed that we're not actually out studying trees or rocks to find morality. This is something that happens within rational agents. So morality is a rational enterprise. And if moral realism is true, then there are objective duties and values. Now, then the next question comes is like, well, where are they grounded in? I mean, some philosophers have argued, you know, if these things really are objective, they just can't be abstractions floating out in space. I mean, logic, for example. Logic is not just abstractions floating out in space. It's grounded in the description of everything. So we say that, you know, something is logically true if it can be described and whatnot. So there has to be something there to be described. But moral facts moral duties specifically are obligations, they're prescriptions. And so the next question comes is, how do we ground those? Well, I mean, Peter S. Williams says, I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, like the evolutionary history of my species, I must be obligated by something personal. Since there are objective moral obligations that transcend all finite persons or groups thereof, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are most fundamentally obligated. So his basic point is, if morality is a rational enterprise, if moral realism is true, and morality is not grounded in humans itself, then it must be grounded in some sort of personal, necessary, rational source. Well, this personal, necessary, rational source is just what we call God. It is the source, where these moral obligations come from, that obligate us or prescribe to us to do the good or to love one another. And that is who we look to for moral guidance. That's essentially just what we call God. So we're not saying we have moral realism and then, well, we have God, so let's just ground it in him. We reason to an actual source that we call God. So that's kind of how the moral argument works and the way I put it forward.
So what are your initial thoughts on that, Alex?
Well, I would first sort of preface it by saying that I don't necessarily have so much of a problem with that. It's something that I haven't entertained as much as what we've been discussing so far, because like you say, in order for this argument to make any sense, you have to suppose that moral realism is true. And since I don't think that, it's like, I don't necessarily know that I can show this part of this premise to be false, but I wanted to kind of entertain it and give it a go. So I suppose I want to get to the bottom of what you mean when you say like morality is grounded in something. Like, okay,
well, talk about like the laws of physics. Okay, what would you say the laws of physics are grounded in?
Gosh, well, I'm not sure how I'd phrase it. I don't know. I mean, what would you say?
Let's say like, okay, so the laws of Britain, where are they grounded in?
Okay.
You would say I'm not an expert on British law.
Yeah, might be better. Well, interesting. It's probably better to use the US because you have a nifty document. We have
a nifty document. That's
we have a headache of a constitution. So but I see what you're saying. Yeah.
We would say American law is grounded in the Constitution. We would say physical laws are grounded in the universe. We would say the laws of logic are grounded in everything, basic reality. So if we have moral prescriptions, they're not descriptions like the examples I gave. But they would have to be grounded in some source as well.
Okay, so with legislative law, you would say that, for instance, it's a fact that it is a law that I don't know, that gay people can get married, or that abortions can take place up to the third trimester, for instance. Now, but that doesn't. But there's no grounding for the actual content of that law.
Well, we would say it's grounded in the legislative procedures. These laws, they don't just exist out in the ether. We would say they have been grounded within our society. Political laws. I mean,
okay, but I would say that really they do kind of they don't exist. Laws don't exist, if you know what I mean. They are
they're not things.
They're like a contract. They're like an understanding. They're an agreement. They're not. So does that necessarily have to be grounded in anything other than our experience?
Well, if they're grounded in our experience, okay, then
I would say that they are. Laws effectively are.
Well, look at it like the laws of mathematics. We would say they're not things either, but they're clearly grounded in like the dimensions of my table. I could say it's 3 by 6 or 4 by 6, whatever it is. And so we sort of have the law there. It's not a thing. Like I can't pick it up and throw it at you. But we would say that it's clearly grounded in something. And we would say, the laws of mathematics, of course, are grounded in reality itself. So, I mean, I don't advocate the transcendental argument you see advocated by people like Matt Slick. I
need some clarity real quick, because earlier, Michael, you said that moral obligations, moral duties are irreducible. So how can they, on your view, be grounded in God?
Well, grounding and reducing are two different things. If you're going to say they're reducible, they're reducible to smaller parts. I would say they're grounded in and of themselves within a necessary rational source. So, you got to remember there's a difference between reductionism and grounding. These are different things within ontology. So, I mean, I think a good maybe a,
okay.
a good example.
Let me try this then. So, let's say, for instance, it is the case that the laws that we have are grounded in governments and legislative bodies. Does that mean that laws cannot exist without those legislative bodies?
Well, laws can, but they would not be those specific laws grounded in the legislatures.
Okay, but
so can exist and what does exist are two different things. So if we started
do you think I didn't mean to interrupt you there, sorry.
Go ahead, yeah, it's fine.
Do you think it is possible that the laws of morality could have existed differently?
No. In the same way, I would not say that the laws of mathematics could have been differently. So I would argue from, as Thomas Nagel argues, there's no possible world within possible world semantics that we could logically construct where rape could be a good thing. So this is between objective and subjective. So, I mean, I would challenge it on that. I would say that in every possible world, rape is going to be wrong. So, no, I don't think they could have been different because they're objective. That's
an interesting thing to try and justify. Like, in every possible world, rape would be wrong.
Every logical, when we say possible worlds, I'm not talking about like different universes.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. Like logically. But so
I would say that unless you can give me an example where,
Earlier you said, I asked you, is it possible that moral realism is false? And you said yes.
Well, we're talking about that within metaethics. Now, what I'm talking about is within metaphysics. So, it is possible that I subjectively could have just the wrong intuitions. I could, be a brain in a vat somewhere. But, it's different than me saying if I'm arguing for moral realism already, I'm going to argue that rape is always wrong. Now, subjectively, maybe I just experience things wrong. So these are different forms of what we're talking about in different areas.
There's a difference between epistemic possibility and metaphysical possibility.
That's what I'm getting at.
So this is what I'm trying to clarify here. So, for instance, would you say if it is possible that I mean, you recognize that it is logically possible that ethical non-cognitivism could be true, or
right?
Would you? Right. Okay. So
now there's a different. Now let me ask you this. Okay, borrow an example from Saul Kripke. It's possible logically that water is not H2O. It's not possible in like a metaphysical sense. So based on what we know about H2O and water, they're metaphysically identical, but logically they could be. So there's a huge difference between those two things. That's why we need to distinguish between epistemology and metaphysics in this.
So if I said, if it's possible that ethical non-cognitivism is true, then surely that means that in some possible world, ethical non-cognitivism is true.
I would talk about that within epistemology. Yeah, there could be a possible world in that.
Okay.
But if we're in metaphysics, where we've already kind of gotten past for it in terms of the moral argument.
But don't they overlap? I mean, if in a possible universe, ethical non-cognitivism is true, then can it not also be the case that in such a possible universe, rape could be morally virtuous? Does that not follow?
Well, I'm going back to the difference between metaphysics and epistemology. For all we know, in an epistemic world, moral non-cognitivism could be true. I thought we've already kind of moved past that with regards to the moral argument. So if we've already established our metaphysics and our metaethics, then we can sort of move past that within that regards. Now, for all we know, we could be completely and utterly mistaken, and there could be a possible world where rape is neither bad nor wrong. But if we're going to talk about within metaphysics, I'm going to go back to the water versus H2O type thing.
So we can also put it in terms of like a conditional statement. Not to cut you off, Alex. We could put it like this. So if moral realism is true, then there are necessary moral facts. But then the question is moral realism true? That's different.
But so you're saying that if that
conditional statement is necessarily true.
Yeah. Okay. So that's why I was asking. So you would say that moral truths, granted moral realism, if we're saying that is the case, that moral truths are necessary.
Right. Yeah. If that's
Okay.
so.
Okay, so granting that, then moral truths are necessary. So in every possible world, rape would be wrong.
Rape would always be wrong, right?
And then the question is like, so it's possible that moral realism is false. However, that conditional statement, if moral realism is true, then moral facts are necessary. That is a necessary statement, and
that's fine.
So, and that's just basically how the moral argument kind of flows. And so I have been vocal about like how I don't like Craig's form of the argument, because I remember listening to a podcast called Real Theology, and I forget who they had on, but he brought up the moral argument, and he said, okay, so you've shown moral facts are true, so how does that get you to God? And so that's one of my biggest problems with Craig's version. That's why I try to formulate it in a different way. And that's
did you have another argument for that? I mean, we because we did this one that's sort of like rational, the rational argument. But do you have like another
sure. Yeah. I mean, for example, look at something like
a few more minutes. So
yeah, look at something like the moral ideal. So it makes sense when we say a person is morally good, but it seems incoherent to say that moral goodness exists by itself as a necessary abstraction. It's because moral goodness and moral badness seem to be properties of agents. So it's far more rational than moral value.
Can that be the case? Again, not to interrupt you, but it's crucial. If we're granting moral realism, I don't know if you can say that, because if you're going to say that that moral, you seem to be saying that morality can't be true in an abstract sense. It's only a quality of a moral agent. Well, isn't that precisely the argument against moral realism, that the fact that morality doesn't exist in abstract form and is only a quality of abstract agents?
Well, no, we're talking about a grounding sense in what we're talking about. So we're talking about like the moral ideal. If I say it is good to, prevent rape. Okay, so I'm talking about things that happen within rationality, within things that happen within discourse between agents itself. So, I mean, you have these principles, you have these standards. But when we talk about the moral ideal, I mean, it's far more rational if moral values and duties are properties of agents and just not mere abstractions. So we're talking about grounding, not if something is real or an identity theory or just eliminative. So if we talk about the moral idea, there are objective moral values and duties. It simply reasons that the moral ideal is grounded, not necessarily real, but grounded in a necessary agent that is the moral ideal. So when we want to compare certain things, we tend to talk about things within how agents are. If we say this person is good, we would compare them to an agent that is bad. So that's sort of how Peter S. Williams, for example, argues for moral ideal, along with moral prescriptions and obligations.
Okay. So are you saying that do you think that the moral ideal exists? Is that kind of what you're calling God?
Or is that how you describe moral ideal would best be described as this necessary rational source?
I'm interested. I don't know if perhaps this is what you were already trying to do, but just in case you weren't, I mean, do you have a way of justifying the fact that there is the existence of a moral idea, of a moral ideal?
Well, we would say that basically we can look at something as being perfectly morally good. Now, when we talk about that, we're talking about an actual agent, because we cannot talk about a rock being perfectly morally, being the moral ideal, because they're not moral agents. So when we're describing what would be morally perfect, we're describing personal aspects of something. And so it's far more likely we're describing a personal source versus just personal, just non-personal abstractions. So, I mean, Peter S. Williams put this paper on his website, Be Thinking. I put a lot of it into my video, Is God the Same as Moral Goodness? And so I kind of elaborate on more in that video if you were interested to kind of take a look at it. But that's kind of where I explain a lot of this.
Okay, so are you just kind of saying, again, it doesn't really matter, because I don't have so much of a gripe with you doing this, but where Cameron asks you, do you have another argument that morality must be grounded in God? You say, well, if we have the idea of a moral ideal, then God must exist. But if you're saying that the moral ideal just is God, then all you're kind of saying there is that, well, God exists.
Well, we have to distinguish between the ideal along with what it's grounded in. For example, if I were to describe the most perfect personality, and I would say it's a young, very smart British kid in his 18 or 19, who's got a nice little smile right there, I would be describing your personality. But that personality is also grounded in you, even though I'm describing it. So if I'm describing a moral ideal, it seems far more likely I'm describing something personal versus something not. Just if I was describing a personality, you're going to think personal aspects, not just mere abstractions.
Sure thing. And flattery will get you nowhere in winning the debate, I might add, but in case that was a covert try. But I'm interested in how you know that this moral ideal exists. Like not necessarily the thing that it's grounded in, but how do you know that the moral ideal exists? How do you know that there is a supremely virtuous moral character, let's say?
Well, that's a good question. I think that goes back to moral realism. I think if we can establish moral realism is the best explanation, then we infer from there a grounding in some sort of personal agent. So
if I were to say that medicine is objective in the sense that you could say that certain medicines objectively improved health.
I would say that's grounded in descriptions of health itself.
Okay.
Prescriptions.
Okay, but the reason I bring it up is to say you could objectively demonstrate that there are two different medicines which kind of are equal in their conduciveness to health. So you couldn't necessarily create a hierarchy of medicine and show what is the supreme medical prescription, but is not the same thing true of morality. It's like, just even if objective truth exists, this is something Sam Harris talks about. This is why he called it the moral landscape. It's the idea that even if you can have objective morality, even if moral realism is true, that doesn't mean that you can have an ideal moral character, because there can be multiple different peaks in the moral landscape, multiple different things which get you close to good or have the same level of goodness, let's say, and there are different ways of achieving that. So is it possible to say that you can really have this hierarchy of morality and have at the top a supremely moral being? And how can you say that there couldn't coexist another supremely moral being that had a different morality but an equally viable one?
Well, I think that's getting kind of into, you're kind of bordering back into moral realism, whereas like if it's plurality versus monism within that realm itself. I remember you kind of brought this up in your discussion with Rationality Rules on this, and he kept kind of bringing up health as an example. And all I wanted to say was, well, health is just a description. As you were trying to point out to him, that doesn't show that we ought to prescribe these certain things.
Well, I would say the whole crux of my argument is that morality is just a description, and that doesn't show that we ought to do these things. Like good and bad is just a description.
I would agree that his argument was descriptive. I get what you're saying in that discussion.
But I would say that any argument for moral realism is the same. It's like you're descriptively saying that there is good and bad. You're descriptively saying that we experience an ought, but you can't say that you therefore ought to do something.
Well, right. I don't believe
we're back in the other argument.
I don't believe the ought is in the description of reality. That would be an ethical naturalist. But with the moral ideal, I mean, we're kind of assuming that there could, in fact, be other moral agents. And when we talk about something like, just take a look at one specific moral ought, like we ought not to rape. The ideal for that would be someone who never rapes. So that would be the moral ideal within that. And we would say that we're describing, of course, an agent within that point. If we wanted to say that another aspect of moral ideal that we should be, if we could ever achieve moral perfection, then we ought to not rape, we ought to not lie, we ought to not steal, we ought to not cause unnecessary harm. We're describing basically I wouldn't say like there's another view other than like divine command theory called the ideal observer theory. I'm almost describing the ideal observer of moral ethics in that sense. So, but I'm not. I don't really prescribe to either of those. I just want to argue that.
So, you said that in a normative sense, you tend to err on virtue ethics. So, yes. For instance, you would say that it's objectively true that. Can you give me a virtue that you think is objectively good or has an obligation attached to it?
Within virtue ethics, I would say that we ought to love one another as we love ourselves.
Okay, so would you extend that to things like you ought to be a honest person, perhaps?
Of course, yeah, we ought to be honest.
So this is where I have a slight problem, perhaps, again, with this idea of hierarchy and the moral ideal. And again, this is kind of a sidestep because I don't know if this would bring down the argument, and even so, it doesn't matter if it doesn't, because I still disagree with the earlier premise. But just as a matter of interest, it's like, if you have this, if your argument here is about having the existence of a moral ideal and having to be able to ground that in something, can you have a moral ideal as a virtue ethicist? I mean, can you say that it is possible to be maximally just or maximally loving? Surely there's no way to quantify that in a way. Like, you could have people who get to that peak in different ways, that there's no single hierarchy of virtue.
Well, you're still getting to, I mean, you could say that there was a peak and there are many roads up to that peak, I guess you could say.
But could you say that
the ultimate goal is to be, perfectly virtuous, to be loving? And, one of the things that often bring up is like, if God is morally perfect, is he always, then when is he morally just? When is he morally merciful? So, and the response to that, as I've often given, is that, God in his perfect knowledge would know when he ought to provide justice and when he ought to be merciful. So I don't necessarily think one of the virtues is always providing justice or always being merciful. Those would be extensions of love itself. At some points you have to give tough love. At some points you need to give merciful love, I guess you could say.
Well, in a way, if we're defining mercy as the suspension of justice, then if it's necessary that God, being the supreme being, has to be just at all times, then you could say that there really is no conception of mercy, because it's not mercy, so to speak. It's like it's ultimately just justice, but with a viewpoint that extends beyond why we would, why does this person deserve this? What that seems to us to be mercy, but it seems like the concept of mercy doesn't really make any sense if you're ascribing God the virtue of justice and the supreme version of perfect justice. If mercy is the suspension of justice, then I don't think you could necessarily do that. And also, what happens when different virtues, like these two virtues, what happens when they contradict each other? Like, can you be supremely merciful and supremely just if mercy is the suspension of justice?
Right.
Before you answer, Michael, we're very, very close to the end here, and so if you could just give your response, and then unfortunately we're gonna have to move into like closing thoughts and stuff before we head out. I have two kids, and my wife's sister is here, like helping watch them right now, so she's probably like at her wit's end. So I've got to head out here pretty quickly. So let's just get your response, Michael, and then we'll close it out.
I don't necessarily.
Other than that, it's been an amazing conversation.
Right. I don't necessarily think that one ought to be that. The justice, of course, is the highest virtue, or neither is mercy. I would say they are extensions of love. We need to know when we ought to apply both of those within the construct of love itself.
Like subsets. So they're not virtues in themselves. Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So I'd probably lean more towards hierarchical moral realism, but it's another topic for another time, I guess. But
yeah. So let's move into some closing thoughts, and we'll end on you, Alex. So let's get Michael your thoughts first about like where the discussion has gone. Just hit my mic here.
No, I was very happy with it.
And then.
Yeah, I think we definitely covered a lot of ground. I was really happy with how the discussion turned out. But yeah, I would just go. I think the main disagreement is like there are two types of atheists when it comes to this. When it comes to the moral argument, there are atheists that would say that moral realism is false, but if God exists, then you probably could have it. And there are some atheists that say moral realism is true, like Ruth Schaefer-Landau or Thomas Nagel, but that doesn't necessarily lead to God's existence. So it seems like Alex in this is leaning more towards moralism. It's the false kind of side, even though and there are some atheists that actually deny both. I don't want to just deny that, but I think in terms of the discussion, this is definitely more borders on if moral realism is true or not. And I think given how we understand it, as I've been kind of explaining the discussion, it seems to be more likely objective. And if I'm just going to close with one quick quote here, because I do love quotes, but it's from Ruth Schaefer-Landau, who's one of my favorite metaethicists. He says, if realism about some domains is a credible position, like with science or logic or math, then we need some further independent argument for thinking that moral realism is implausible. So I want to see some good arguments to argue that. And that's always been the challenge from moral realists to the other areas of metaethics. You need to address this, because as even someone like J.L. Mackie or Simon Blackmore acknowledged, the intuitive starting point is moral realism, and they have to build the case against it. So that's where the heart of the argument is.
Yeah, and so Alex, just your thoughts about the discussion, and then we'll close it out.
Sure. I think you're right to say that this whole argument hinges on that premise of moral realism. That's where the crux of my argument is, and that's why the second half of this conversation, or I suppose the final quarter, you'd call it, was not as I wasn't really expressing an opinion, because to me that's not where my problem lies. It lies with the idea of moral realism. And you're right in that usually there are two sets of atheists: the ones who are moral realists and the ones who are not. But they're not moral realists because they don't believe in God. Well, I would say that even outside of that, I'd say that I don't believe in moral realism. And even if God did exist, then I don't think you could have it. It's hard to pin down exactly where the disagreement lies. I think we both recognize that there is a very strong intuition of morality. I think that we both recognize that we can conduct our moral business, whether or not morality is objective, even if you think it requires some backwards philosophical thinking. Like, it's possible to do so. But I think that ultimately, if your main kind of argument and closing thought there is to say, well, if we're not going to question, scientific epistemology, why would we question moral epistemology? Well, I'd say that basically comes back to what I said at the beginning, which is, let's not get confused. You can't just say that the only way that we could prove morality to be objective is if we had some way to demonstrate whether certain propositions were true or false. It's like, according to the skepticism of scientific epistemology, we can't know whether this cup exists, but we still know that objectively it does or doesn't. It's true or false that this cup exists. Whereas with morality, even in the exact same way, there's no difference, because I'm also saying I can't know whether murder is right or wrong. But what I'm saying is that it can't be right or wrong. So whereas with the cup, I'm saying it either exists or does not exist, and I don't know which, and that's your scientific skepticism. With morality, I'm saying not only can you not know which is the case, neither can be the case. So I think there is a distinction there, and I think that difference warrants treating morality differently in terms of skepticism to treating scientific empiricism, but that might not convince everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guys, thanks for coming on to the show. It was I'll have to do it again. Maybe not on the same argument, maybe on something else, but either way, thanks, Alex, for coming on. I know that we have something coming up here too, so be on the lookout for that. And then, Michael, always a pleasure to have you on the show. We'll have to again have you on with somebody else. You cover a lot of ground on your YouTube channel. So
yeah, next video will be on the Gospel of Thomas. So I'm all over the place.
Literally all over the place. Well, anyways, like I said, thanks guys for coming on. And if you want to check out more of what we have going on, just head to the website. Everything is posted there. Everything, all the social media links, everything. So just go to capturingchristianity.com. And until next time, we'll see you guys later.